to introduce myself a little bit, I want to tell you kind of who I am and then why in the world I'm on this side of the stage. So my name is Cassidy. As Chris said, I'm married to Jesse. He's sitting over there. We've been married for 13 years. We have 4 kids, 3 girls and a boy. They are 3, 5. I have a picture. Yes, it worked. 3, 5, 7, and 9. Yes, we match here. This is not normal. I'm not that put together. This is Mother's Day, the one day a year they wear what I tell them to wear. And we take a picture out on the church island, which I recommend for photo ops. So I'm a mom. I talk a lot to kids. I'm also a pediatric nurse at Inlow 1 day a week. So when I'm not caring for my kids, I'm maybe taking care of somebody else's. I'm also in school to become a lactation consultant, my big passion. And for the last 9 years, about once a month, I teach Sunday school over in Neighbor Kids. So, Tammy, woo! So, grown-ups in big church, as my kids would say, is not my typical audience. I thought about having you guys like sit on the floor, and I would sit in a chair and make myself all comfortable, but we're not going to do that. So, and then why I'm up here. When Andrew asked me to speak, my gut reaction was like, you are crazy. Like, I don't know. I sit over there. I don't go up here. But like Chris said, I have a past in being in leadership, and I've missed it, and it feels like a little bit of my life being revived. And so I want to thank you, church, for being the kind of people, to Andrew, for creating this culture that invites vulnerability and honesty and transparency as we live life together. So don't know what you're going to get today, but here we go. And then also, this last year, God has been kind of awakening my soul. He was quiet, or I couldn't hear him amidst the chaos of my house for a lot of years. And this year, he's been teaching me a lot about humility. That is a painful branch to be cut off, but it needs to happen for us to be more like Jesus. And so as I was reading through the Sermon on the Mount, knowing that was I went too far. This is very sensitive. Just being real, y'all. Oh my gosh. Can you guys put it on the Sermon on the Mount picture again for me? Thank you. So reading through the Sermon on the Mount and realizing that God had been specifically working on the area of judging in my life, and that, like, what are the chances that this would be happening, that I would ever be asked to come up here and speak, and then that I would have the opportunity to pick the topic that God has been refining in me. So that's who I am, and that is why I'm here. And I'm just glad you guys are all here to smile back at me. So, first, I want to talk a little bit about the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. When we look at it as a whole, it's Matthew 5, 6, and 7, if you're not familiar. It can feel a little daunting. There's a lot of don'ts. There's a lot of, you've heard it said, you shouldn't do this. And if we look at it as a whole, it can be overwhelming. And I have 2 things to say about that. One is that Jesus didn't say that this life was going to be easy. A little further down from where we're sitting today, Matthew 7, 13 through 14, he says, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. This is the NLT. I like this version. The highway to hell is broad, and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. But the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few will ever find it. And that's not to scare you, but it's true. There's nothing easy about the transparency and vulnerability and honesty it takes to be honest with ourselves, with others, and with God. Recognize our sin and course correct. That can hurt. But more importantly, we see John 10:10, Andrew's favorite verse. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come, Jesus says, that they may have life and have it to the full. We are not supposed to be able to do any of this by ourselves. And if we try, we will fail. But the same Spirit that lived in Jesus, that lives in Jesus, lives in us and gives us the ability to have this life to the fullest. And it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but what it does mean is that when we allow him to come in and transform our lives, the Lord of hosts wants us to be on his team. He wants us to partner with him in work. And the fullness of that life is so much greater than anything the world could ever offer us. Andrew gave a message back on May 12th. You can find it on the website, NC Chico, Neighborhood Church Chico, ncchico.org, called Life to the Fullest. And in that, he says, the Sermon on the Mount, in fact, the gospel as a whole, is not a sin management program. It is a heart transformation program. In the Sermon on the Mount, we see what feels like rules, but it's not. Jesus gets to the heart of the matter, and he's telling us if we allow him to come in and change our hearts in this way, the fullness of life that we can have is going to be mind-blowing. And when we do that, it will actually be easier to reconcile than to be angry, easier to give than to keep, easier to love than to hate, to show mercy than to judge. So, today we tackle judgment. Matthew 7, 1 through 5. One other thing, before we begin, I just want to ask that if you are sitting out there today and you feel like, I struggle with some stuff, like maybe worry, anxiety, maybe even lust, but I don't really struggle with judgment. So I'm just going to doodle, and I don't know if there's a game on today, but check the score or something. I know people do that. So I would just plead with you that a year ago, I didn't know that I struggled with judgment the way that I did. It sort of blindsided me, and looking back, I am so grateful that God cares about me enough to want to shape me to be more like Jesus, but it caught me off guard. So try to keep your ears open. And maybe you don't. Maybe this is a work that God has done in your life and you have victory. Praise God. Okay, so we're going to start by just reading it, and then we will look at it in smaller sections. I'm going to look over here. Matthew 7, 1 through 5. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Ouch. So, this being the beginning of chapter 7, Jesus has had 2 full chapters now, 5 and 6, to give us instructions on these heart transformations that he is offering to us. And I just thought it was interesting, almost a little funny, that he would put this here. It sort of feels like he's saying, if you think this message is for the person next to you, or if you're thinking, gosh, I wish so-and-so was here at church today to hear this is so good, he's saying, nope, stop judging. This is for all of you. You all have to claim this. So, before we continue, I want to define judgment. In this passage, it can be defined and used 2 different ways. One is that of evaluation and discernment. Jesus actually instructs us to use this type of discernment. He is not warning us against this type of discernment. In fact, again, a little farther from where we're reading today, Matthew 7:15 says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. We are supposed to discern truth from error. This is told to us. Further, Jesus does not oppose offering correction to our brothers and sisters in Christ, but only offering it in the wrong spirit. Matthew 18:15 says, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault. And it goes on to tell us how to offer correction in a godly way. Another verse that we're going to get back to at the end as well is Galatians 6:1 that says, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently, in caps, gently. So surely there is a place for this type of discernment and splinter removal, if you will. The second definition, though, is that of condemnation or authoritative pronouncement of guilt, holding the position of a judge. And James 4:12 says, there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and to destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor? This type of condemnation is what Jesus is warning us against. When beginning to study this passage, I got a little hung up on the beginning. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. What does that mean? It's not specific. Is he saying, do not judge, or you'll be judged by others, like do to others as they would do to you? Or is he saying, in fact, do not judge, or God will judge you? Like, it just didn't sit well. I was surely hoping it wasn't the second. But in fact, it is. Also studying this passage, it had a lot of metaphorical language, planks and splinters, and it was just harder to swallow. It was harder to understand than a lot of the other passages. I think the easiest one to understand was do not murder. You have said, do not murder, traditional teaching, vicious intention, cycle of the heart, of anger, and then the transforming action of reconciliation. That was really straightforward. I found this passage to be slightly more metaphorical and confusing. But in actuality, in verse 1, when he says, do not judge, or you too will be judged, God is saying that Jesus is saying that we will be judged by God, because this kind of judging, this authoritative condemnation, assumes a position of authority, a divine prerogative, and final judgment belongs to God alone. And when we seek to judge others now, we will answer for assuming his position. And I think that's pretty convicting and scary. It really is as powerful as do not murder. When evaluating these two definitions, and they're very different purposes and repercussions, I think that it can be very easy to blur the lines between the two. It is really easy to think that we are good intended, that we are righteously evaluating something or someone, and then remember that thief that comes to steal, kill, and destroy? We can easily have our mind confused and twisted, and before we know it, we are on this path of condemnation. I had this happen. I would like to very humbly share a story of when I was caught in this this year. Back in January, when New York passed their late-term abortion law, I got all riled up. I felt like I was seeking righteousness. It felt so good intended, like that, how, God, are you letting this happen? And I felt anger and sadness, and I had the best of intentions. I really did. But my good intentions quickly turned that of self-righteousness, and much against my normal Facebook posts of pictures of my kids. First of all, please don't post on Facebook when you're riled up. Like, sleep on it and then decide in the morning. I posted, "This is murder," with a link to an article about the law. And even when I posted it, I felt like, yeah, doing the right thing. Amen. I'm like evaluating. And I got a response from a non-Christian acquaintance that is pro-abortion, that had had an abortion-type procedure because of complications with her pregnancy. And she was so hurt. I gravely hurt her with my condemning approach. And God graciously used my mistake to teach me about his love and mercy, not only for me, but for everyone, that I am no better than anybody else because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So that was hard, and I sort of, best that I could with this acquaintance, reconciled, but I know that what I said hurt my testimony as a follower of Jesus in her eyes. I was being a hypocrite. And though I have apologized for my approach, you can't really get that back. So because I brought it up, I just want to say that if there are, I'm betting there's at least a few women in this room that have had abortions, and we have no right to judge you, no right to judge one another. The mercy and love that God shows to us, he shows to all of us. And I just want to apologize on behalf of Jesus followers if you've ever felt unlovingly condemned. So I share that, as humbling as it is, just to show you how easily it is to be confused, to think that we are righteously evaluating something but then condemning, because God does not want us to hurt one another. Moving on to verses 3-5. We're going to read them again. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Jesus warns us that even if we knew people's hearts, their intentions, their genetics, how their day went that day, we would still have no right to judge unless we ourselves had lived sinless, blameless lives, never needing God's forgiveness. There's a familiar Bible story, John 8:7-11, that Jesus tells about a woman who was brought to him that was caught in adultery by the rulers of the day, and they were seeking condemnation and judgment, that number 2 definition, against her. And who remembers what Jesus said? If any of you is without sin, go ahead and be the first to throw the stone at her. Go ahead and condemn her if you're without sin. And what happened? One by one, they all left. Then Jesus forgives her and tells her to go and sin no more. Church, there is no sin too big for God's forgiveness. And likewise, there should be no sin too big for our gracious reception and extension of God's mercy. That is what we are here to do. Romans 2:3-4 says, so when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think that you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, tolerance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness leads you towards repentance? True followers who have been really impacted by the mercy of God in their lives, will extend that same mercy to others, not judgment. The kind of love that Jesus offers us enables us as his followers to extend that same kindness and tolerance and patience towards each other, not to judge each other. And if we don't have that kind of love in our hearts, but instead vindictive condemnation, I just wonder, have we truly grasped the extent of his mercy and forgiveness to us. I'm not saying that you're not saved. I'm just wondering, have you truly grasped the extent of that? I thought I had, but I realized I hadn't. I became a Christian when I was in elementary school. I was at Sparks at Awanas. And I went to church growing up. I went to church in high school. I went to college church. I was in leadership. I married a Christian, and life went on pretty and not extremely colorful. And a lot of times I felt jealous of the people that had these like radical redemption stories. I felt like, gosh, I know in my head that God is real. I know that he created the world. I know that he created me. I know that Jesus is his son, and Jesus that died for me is the reason for my salvation. Like, I don't think that's not true. But if I had had this like really radical redemption story, maybe I'd feel it more, because it just looks easier to follow him when we can like really feel it. But he doesn't always give us that, and we still have to be faithful when we only can know it. But I've been asking him for, I don't know, about 2.5 years to help me comprehend what it means to be saved. Because in America, sometimes we forget how much we need him. Like, we have cars and we have houses and we have, most of us air conditioning, and sometimes it is paycheck to paycheck. But for the most part, we have what we need tangibly, and we forget our great need for Jesus. And this summer, Jesse and I took our 3 girls to Mexico for 3 weeks on a missions trip, simply to press into the Lord, to what he had for us, and to show our kids a different culture. And while I was there, through a conversation, praise God, it hit me. Me saying that my forgiveness and my salvation isn't enough is like saying that like what Jesus did for me isn't enough. And that's all I needed. It's like, okay, I can grasp this a little bit more. Like, no, I wasn't saved from the pit because I accepted Jesus in my life when I was 5. I don't remember pre-5. But that life to the fullest that he tells us we can have, that Satan wants to steal from us, we don't get that if we don't have our salvation, and that is enough. So I needed to realize and grasp the depth of what it means to be saved by the Lord. And I would just ask that if you're here today and you are a follower of Jesus, to what depth have you grasped and meditated on his grace and forgiveness towards you? Because when we have grasped it, it's easier to overflow and give it to everybody around us. So at this point, I'm guessing that most of you would agree with me. We should not judge one another. Doesn't sound like a good plan. We don't want that consequence. Well, having the right belief is not enough. My kids know that they are not supposed to hit each other, right, girls? Not supposed to fight. But when they do fight, does that belief, I agree, Mom, I shouldn't have done that. Does that keep them from their consequences? No, it doesn't. They still get their consequences. I'm glad for their changed hearts, but they still get their consequences. So why I'm saying that is that Jesus demands more than agreement from us. He demands obedience in the same way we demand obedience from our kids. Even the Pharisees would have agreed that judging is wrong, but they judged a lot, the Bible shows us. When we rationalize away our own guilt, we are blinded. We are blinded. We cannot see clearly to remove the speck from our brother's eye. Jesus doesn't specify any blinding planks in this passage. I think he leaves it open because there are quite a few. A few that easily came to mind for me are that of pride, anger, lust, jealousy, comparison, coveting. Social media has made comparing and coveting very easy. Worry, or the plank of judging itself. There's so many things we judge. We judge each other's parenting. We judge each other's housekeeping. We judge each other's work ethic, immunization choices, hot topic. So this type of judging often comes from some degree of self-righteousness. And it is so blinding to have that log of self-righteousness coming out of your face. And we often rationalize away our own guilt, but never that of others. I think about speeding, for example. I don't know if you guys knew this, but the road from like Home Depot to church is 25 miles an hour. Try to get off the freeway and the skyway and like drive 25 miles an hour. I was really conscious about it today, and it felt so awkward. So sometimes I speed when I'm late to teach Sunday school because I think like, well, I can't be late. I had to run out the door. The kids were like yelling at me, and I just need to drive a little faster. I totally justify it. Like I'm still speeding. Like you could give me a ticket. But if someone zooms past me on the freeway, do I like come up with all the reasons why they might be doing that? Like I'm sure they needed to. No, I totally judge them. And it's simple, and that's like a really simple example, but we do this with bigger stuff too, you guys. And when we do this, we are being hypocrites, imposing a double standard, and we don't want to be guilty of that. I want to read verse 5 one more time. You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I both like and dislike this quote because it's so true from Brennan Manning. It says, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And that's what I did when I judged my friend, when I judged the abortion law. I think there is a degree of discernment we can have, but when our hearts turn to that authoritative condemnation, we are being hypocrites. I want you guys to imagine with me. You can close your eyes if you want or leave them open. It's up to you. I'm a nurse, so forgive my yucky graphic here. I want you to imagine what it might actually look like to have a large piece of wood sticking out of your face, not your face, sticking out of a man's face, at the place where his eye should be. Imagine a 2x4, a 6-foot-long 2x4. We can all imagine that. Sticking out of the place where his eye should be. Pretty nasty. That's the worst part, don't worry. Better yet, imagine this person with the 2x4 in their eye walking around downtown Chico, totally unaware of the wood. Imagine the damage they would be causing, running into people, knocking over shelves, breaking windows. It would get quite messy. Imagine now this reckless, unaware person wearing a doctor's coat and walking into the doctor's office where you are waiting to meet your surgeon for your upcoming eye surgery. Would you want a reckless, unaware, dangerous, blind surgeon operating on your eyes? Of course not. And acknowledging that we may in fact be that unaware, keyword unaware, blind, reckless person is crucial here. And while it is important to become aware of what our blinding planks are, it is even more important to realize that it is those blinding planks that blind us and dictate the filter and lens by which we see and attempt to judge other people. We have to have clear vision, and we can only have this when we are humble and accepting of God's grace and forgiveness on our lives and extend that same grace and forgiveness to each other. Speaking of eyes, I think that Jesus uses the image of eyes for a reason. Eyes are very fragile and sensitive, and think of like how gentle you are when you take an eyelash out of your child's eye. You're very careful with these eyes. And I believe that this is the same kind of gentle care that we need to take with each other's hearts when we are doing that correct kind of discernment. We need to be gentle. This takes us back to the verse I mentioned in the beginning, Galatians 6:1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. So, judging will happen. We will be tempted to judge. What do we do with it once it comes up? Do we give in? I'm sure people can relate to this feeling. Do we give in to that like power feeling in our gut where we start to feel superior and we can think of all the reasons why what someone has done is wrong? Do we give in to that? Or do we notice that feeling, stop, reflect, and ask God to show us what is causing us to have this self-righteousness and ask forgiveness and then move on from there? And maybe there is some discerning and evaluating that needs to happen. But first we need to recognize that we are blinded by those planks. I had a success story this week. I was given some information about some friends. This will be vague. And I didn't like this information, and I immediately began to judge. Like, that was just my first reaction was, why are they making this choice? Well, if that were me, I wouldn't have made that choice. Well, if they would have, done X, Y, and Z, like I've done, they're not going to make that choice. And immediately God stopped me, not just because I was preparing for this message, but because he has been doing a work. And he said, stop, you need to stop. And I prayed and I asked God, what is causing me to have this authoritative condemnation feeling, God? And he showed me my sin in it. I hate to say it, but I was jealous. I was prideful, and that self-righteousness crept in, and I asked for forgiveness, and my view of the situation was completely different. And the fact that feeling went away and the fact that God is real and active and changes our lives, that feeling is life to the greatest, life to the fullest. And it's totally worth how uncomfortable and sometimes painful it is to have those planks yanked out of our eyes. So, we're almost done, you guys. It goes faster when you're up here. To conclude, I want you to ask yourselves two questions. One is, to what depth do I understand God's grace and forgiveness over my life? And two is my spiritual vision being blinded and affecting the lens by which I am evaluating others? And this one we need to ask ourselves very frequently. It can be uncomfortable, like I said, or downright painful to have a plank removed from your eye, but the ability to see clearly is totally priceless.